Hey everybody, today I want to talk about creation. But I want to talk about it in the sense of it being an apologetic to its surrounding neighbors that are nearby. Because everybody that lived by Israel, they had a creation account. And I want to show you today how that creation account kind of is similar to what happens in Genesis, but more importantly, there's some important differences. That's what I want to talk about on the Midweek Snack. All right, in order to understand the ancient context, we have to read the first two verses of Genesis 1, because this is kind of a shared idea here. It says that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Okay, so what you have here is darkness. You have the deep there. In that culture, the water, the deep, the darkness was all associated with chaos, things that were out of control, things that needed to be rectified by a god or gods. And in the Bible, what we read is that the Spirit of God, it's referring to Elohim or Yahweh, was hovering over the face of the waters. He's about to do his creative thing, okay? Now, what I've done is I have put a little graph together that indicates kind of what happens, how this creation account is broken down in the Hebrew Bible. So, two categories. First is an ordered realm or an environment that has to happen, that has to be created first. And secondly, there's an ordered habitation, right? Who is going to live in these particular regions? Okay, so day one correlates with day 4 because God says, let there be light, and he creates the day and the night, and he calls it good. Now, this daylight that happens is not a reflection from the sun or the moon or the stars that we see today, but it was actually God's glory. And in the Bible, that's something that happens again at the end, because the situation is reversed, because when heaven comes down from the sky, all of a sudden, there's no more need for the sun, because the author says that God becomes our light, and that light lasts forever and ever. Okay? So in creation, God's light was first, but then came the heavenly lamps. That's what it looks like in the Hebrew, kind of this lamp idea that is like turned on. So just imagine like you stringing a Christmas tree, with the big light on, and then turning it off, and then just showing the lights of the Christmas tree. God, in a sense, was the light. He basically strings the universe with the sun and the stars and the moon and the galaxies and everything else. And they serve as light to help guide people through the seasons and the times. And so it's really a replacement that God gives permission so that they can really illuminate God's glory. Okay, so day 2 and day 5, they connect because of this expanse that talks about in day 2, that God creates this expanse. In the Hebrew, it's kind of a dome kind of figure that separates the waters below and above. Okay? And the waters below, of course, need to be filled up. The sky above this dome needs to be filled up. And so God on day 5 creates living creatures to fill the sea. And some of these are really big creatures. And that's going to be important when we get to the creation story of the other nations. And of course, the sky. The sky is filled with birds and other winged kind of animals. So God is in the process of creating, and he tells them to be fruitful and to multiply. Now, day 3 is correlated with day 6 because on day 3, God gathers the oceans and has them in separate spaces, and land comes up, right? So you have this realm of land, and that correlates with day 6 because what are you going to do with that land? How are you going to inhabit it? You're going to have plants grow there. You're going to have animals, living creatures grow there. And of course, the pinnacle of this creation is going to be God is going to create mankind in his image, male and female. And that is so important because what God is doing here is he's creating us in his own image so that we can be human representatives of his glory. Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment as well. And then on day 7, of course, is God's rest. That was the rest that we were supposed to enter into immediately. It's signified by the tree of life. And we know what happened there is that Adam and Eve, instead of obeying God, wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. Okay, so that is the story. And if you look at some of the images and the pictures that really reflect that, they kind of picture the earth kind of like as a dome on top that somehow separated the waters from just drowning them and the waters below. And when you read the accounts of Noah, you find out that the rains came from above and below, and it flooded the earth, okay? So here we have this firmament there, this atmosphere, this canopy, whatever you want to call it. It gives you this idea that somehow that everything is being protected. Now, some of you might be asking the question, well, this doesn't really equal what I envision when it comes to the creation account in Genesis. You know, we think about things like the galaxies and the star systems and the billions of planets, and we're like, why is it so simple? And my answer is this, is that God meets us where we are at. Think about this. This passage was written, Genesis 1, over 3,000 years ago. And so they didn't have the technology that we have today, right? They didn't have cameras. They didn't have telescopes, let alone the Hubble telescope. They didn't have spaceships that could go into the atmosphere and be able to look back upon the earth. They didn't even actually have an image of what the earth looked like. And so they did their best to understand the world from what they observed, from what they seen, and from what God had revealed to them. Because God meets us where we're at. And I'm sure that probably 1,000 years from now, people are going to be looking back at what we think about the creation today, and they're going to say, wow, that was primitive thinking. But again, God meets us where we are at. And the author of Genesis wasn't trying to give you a detailed account, but more of an overview of what happened, because his focus is mainly on meaning. And what do I mean by that? Think about the most meaningful questions you ask in life, like, where am I? How did I get here? What happened? What's going to happen? What's the solution? Like, these are the kind of questions that Genesis really addresses. And when it comes to the culture, they share a commonality in this quest for meaning. They share similar creation accounts. So I already showed you a picture of the domed image that represents this firmament, this canopy, if you will, that separates the waters above from the waters below. I want to take you and look at what the Egyptian account was like. Because in the Egyptian account, there was this one God that basically was created from the water. His name was Atum, and he self-birthed himself. He impregnated himself somehow, some way, where there were these other gods that are responsible for what we look at in the world today. Okay, so first of all, there's the goddess of Nut. And Nut is the one that's kind of stretched out like a dome. And there are stars that are across her body. And in the account, it talks about her breasts are where the rainfall comes down. But again, it's a similar image, isn't it? It's a similar image of somehow this protective kind of like force field that keeps us from getting drenched, like in the days of Noah. Okay? Now, on the bottom, there is another goddess named Ged. And Ged represents the land. And if you look at there's a goddess called Shu, the goddess of the air. And she has her knees on top of Ged. And she's also has her arms in the air, and she's supporting the goddess of Nut. Okay? So just imagery that's just kind of sitting there. There's birds in there. There's creation. This is a world that is very similar to what is described in the Genesis account, minus some very important details. Now, where do they get day and night? This is interesting. There's an Egyptian god of Ra. Some people call him Re. And he's known as the sun god. And so with him, the sun comes and the sun sets. And then evening comes and there's the morning time. And so it's all about a journey. And so he's on this boat in this figure. And he's basically sun rising up to the sky. So that's early morning. He's rising up. So when he gets to the very top where it says Nut, then that is kind of like the sunrise. And then, of course, what happens in the evening is that there is a sunset. And so the god Ra comes down and forms the evening. But when he's done at the evening, it becomes like the Middle Earth morning kind of thing. And that's where he has to go underground into the chaos. And when he goes into the chaos, he has to fight the demons and whatever lurks underneath. And so in this picture, this is a rendition of what happens in that underworld. Okay? So you have another god named Seth, and his responsibility is to protect Ra, and he does so by killing sea serpents. And so here we got Apophis, I believe that's how it's pronounced, is got a spear that goes up the throat, and that threat is done away with. And the boat, because it's the underground and the underworld, is being pulled by the night demons, which consists of jackals and snakes. And so this idea of darkness and uncertainty, and the god Ra is basically saying, I'm getting you through this so that we can have another tomorrow. And that is when the god of Ra springs up again on the left side to introduce us to the next day. So there's evening and there's night that kind of share this similarity with the other culture. So that is one account. But there's also the Babylonian account. And we get that from a cuneiform called the Enuma Elish, and it's basically the Babylonian Genesis, and some people refer to it as the combat myth. And it's based on Egyptian and Sumerian traditions about these primeval waters that are generating a pantheon of old deities, right? A pantheon of just chaos, and they're fighting each other, they're impregnating each other, and you have to wait until the young upstart comes to take care of these deities, and that god's name is Marduk. Okay, so Marduk is the patron god of Babylon, and Marduk is the one that actually is going to be the hero of this story. Because the problem that happens is there is a goddess named Tiamat, and she represents the salty ocean. And she bore a lot of other kinds of gods and semi-gods. But basically, when there's no gods at all, she decides that she wants to basically take over all of the waters that have chaos in it. and she turns herself into a giant sea dragon. Remember, I talked about sea dragons before. They actually play a role as an apologetic even in the biblical account. And this sea dragon, this giant sea dragon, fights Marduk, and Marduk wins the battle and destroys her. And you know what he does? He gets his sword and he cuts her body in half. And the top half of that body forms the heavens or the sky, and the bottom half forms the earth or the land. And that is how the creation account starts there. And then Marduk is going to be able to eventually to create humans. So again, similarities, but there are huge differences in these accounts. And then the last account I want you to look at is the account of the city-state area named the Ugarit. And the Ugarit would be associated with the Canaanites, a very prominent people group that are mentioned in the Bible. And so their god that they worship, their storm god, is called Baal or Baal. Baal. And what he does in the account with them is he battles 4 primordial gods of chaos because they are trying to take control of the world. Now, here's the thing that I found to be fascinating here is that Psalm 74, verses 13 through 14, refutes that Marduk was the hero and says the actual hero was Elohim or Yahweh. Okay? So let me show you how this plays out here. You can see on this slide there are different names for the gods. There's 4 of them. There's Yam, who's the god of the sea. There's Tunan, who is a twisted serpent or a sea monster. There's Latanu, who is this creature that's only described as unbeatable, unpenetrable, scales that not even spears can inhabit, and breathes fire. So this is a serious challenge. Leviathan is how we understand him in the Bible. And then there's the god called Ner, who is the god of the river. So again, in the ancient culture, you see a lot of gods that are associated with rivers and storms and planets and just all kinds of different things that you see with your eyes. Everything is basically assigned a god. So, with that said, in this tradition, Baal is victorious. But look at Psalm 74 here, because now it's turned to God, Yahweh. It says, you, referring to Yahweh, you divided the sea by night. So you divided Yam, the sea god. You broke the heads of the sea monsters on the water. And the word there is Tanin, which is similar to Tanan. You crushed the heads. Notice there are multiple heads on this huge sea, fire-breathing dragon monster, whatever you want to call him. We know him as Leviathan. And so it says Yahweh was the one that crushed the heads, plural, of Leviathan, and gave him as food for the creatures of the wilderness. It's just a big moment of bad to the bone, you know. This is who God is. And then it ends by saying that you split open the springs and the rivers. So Ner was known as the god of the rivers. And there, Nahar is the Hebrew word. And so here you literally have these gods of Baal that are being defeated by Yahweh. And I just think that is such an interesting apologetic by the author, a deliberate thing. Because in the Bible, they're not believing in dragons. They're not believing in these big, giant sea monsters. But it's used more as an apologetic. It's used to basically compete against the other religious views that are in that certain region. And that is kind of what it's like when it comes to the surrounding neighbors of the Israelites. Now, why is that important? Well, first of all, if you were an Israelite that lived in that particular region, you would have contact with them. You would know what their belief system is. And you would simply say, we agree on certain things. We agree that God created the day and the night. We agree that there is land, and we agree that there is this expanse, this atmosphere, however you want to look at it. We share common denominators. But the one main difference is, while you believe in many goddesses like, Gad and Nut, we believe that there is only one God. And he is so powerful that he didn't wait for other gods to create these things. He actually spoke them into existence. Like, that is how God is depicted to the neighbors. And so when it came to some of the other traditions, the big sell for the Israelites was, we don't need to have all these other gods. The God that is in the Bible is the one that actually single-handedly handles chaos. And the heavenly bodies, the beings that you may call God, they are under God's control. And he is the one that actually created them. And he is the one that'll judge them and that'll rule them for those of the heavenly beings that are bad. So that's what you got now. You have this apologetic that's going on. There's a familiarity between what's happening. And so just to kind of tie this into today, to our culture, to our Western mindset, I wanted to illustrate that there are cults and there are religions that talk about similar things that we believe, especially when it comes to Jesus. For example, the LDS community, you might talk about Jesus, but they will never equate Jesus with actually Elohim himself. No, Jesus actually becomes another God. And so in their system, the ideal and the goal of their faith is to reach exaltation so that they can govern their own planet. And where do we see that problem? It's in Genesis chapter 3, when the serpent, who's crafty, goes up to Adam and Eve and says that if you partake of that fruit, remember the fruit tree that was created, you can become just like God, knowing good and evil. So, that's one of the ways where you can talk to your Mormon friends and you can compliment them on the good things they do. But the important thing is to be able to pinpoint how Jesus is the Savior of the world, but also God who dwelt among us. There's only one God. Okay, now what about other religions like, for example, Islam, right? Well, the Muslim, they believe that there is the God that's in the Bible. They believe that God created the world. They don't have a problem with the Genesis account. They don't have a problem with the prophets like Moses and some of the people that are mentioned. But they do have a problem when it comes to the offspring of Abraham, because they believe the promised child was Ishmael, not Isaac. And their whole religious system is based on that. So there's a difference there in this whole creation account and just the unfolding of Scripture. But when it comes to Jesus, they believe Jesus is revered. They believe he was a prophet. They believe he was a Messiah to the Jew. They believe that he did miracles, that he healed people. But they don't believe that Jesus Christ died for our sins. And so I think it's really important when it comes to Muslims especially, because a lot of times there's tension that's there. And we have to learn how to be able to recognize this is what you believe. And I want to show you how that compares to what we believe. and then just kind of allow God to do the rest of that. The Jehovah Witnesses, when it comes to Jesus, they're not even sure exactly who Jesus was, but they do believe that he was mostly Michael the archangel who basically turned into Jesus. And on the cross, when actually on the grave, when Jesus rose, he didn't rise as a physical being, but as a spiritual being. And so there are differences that happen, and that's why it's so important for you to understand the biblical account, what the biblical authors are giving us. So I think that's all I got for today. I hope that sparks some interest, and I just want to say thank you, and that I will see you on the next edition of the Midweek Snack. God bless everybody. Take care.